Hello everyone, my name is May Casey and this is my presentation on the Arizona State Museum Library and Archives, specifically handling Native American materials with respect and sensitivity. This is just a brief summary of what I'll be covering in my presentation, starting with background information on the Arizona State Museum Library and Archives, touching on my interview questions, the existing restrictions that the archives act under, current materials and related policies, ethical dilemmas, the protocols for Native American archival materials, positives, areas for improvement, and discussion questions. The Arizona State Museum Library and Archives is 125 years old, and for the bulk of that time, the library and the archives have actually been combined into one entity. This has created some interesting situations in terms of things like finding aids or funding, sharing personnel, etc. It's located on the University of Arizona's main campus in Tucson. It's considered a department of the university, but it's also a federal repository, and it has responsibilities to the state of Arizona. Notably, it grants permits for surveys and excavations, and then it stores those records and the site information. It also has huge collections of Native American materials, notably the Doris Duke American Indian Oral Projects and the Grenville Goodwin Collection, which we'll discuss later. These next two slides contain the interview questions that I presented to Miss Mary Graham, who is the head archivist. She has been working in library and archives for 40 years and has been the head archivist for about 8 years. My questions focused very specifically around Native American archival material, simply because the archive itself is so huge that I wanted to focus in on something that was really important, and given the amount of Native American materials that the archive holds, that made more sense to focus on than anything else. This is the second half of my interview questions. We did not follow them exactly question by question, but rather use them as a guide in our conversation. And I found that in many moments, we would be talking about something and sort of stumble naturally onto one of my questions. This slide is a fairly basic breakdown of the different types of restrictions that the archive currently functions under. There are federal, state, and institutional restrictions. The federal restrictions are primarily the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, which is also called NAGPRA, and it requires federal institutions to return cultural items when possible. And that means the places they're returning them to have somewhere to store them and keep them safe. It also provides guidelines for accidental discovery and excavation of Native American sites, which is particularly important in Arizona because there is so much excavation that happens here. The Arizona State Museum Library and Archives is also a federal repository, so not only do they have to maintain a collection of 10,000 volumes or more, but they also must provide free access to the public. This creates an ethical conflict when you are trying to protect Native American cultural materials, but also provide access. The state restrictions are multiple, but primarily fall under the Arizona Antiquities Act. They focus on things like archaeological discoveries, giving permits to explore Arizona lands, prohibiting defacing any cultural materials, reporting discoveries or reporting disturbances of human remains, and also related to the unlawful reproduction of original archaeological specimens. For example, it is not permissible to duplicate a picture of a burial or a burial site, though you may duplicate a written description of it because the written description is considered data, but the actual image is considered sacred. So it's one of those things that kind of depends on the situation. Now, as far as the institutional restrictions, the museum is covered by the Arizona Board of Regents, who takes those state laws and creates the rules that they implement in-house. In my interview with Ms. Graham, There were two collections that we spoke a great deal about. The first being the Doris Duke American Indian Project, which was in the 1960s. And basically, individuals were given tape recorders and told to go and talk to Native American tribes to find out everything they could, to record everything they could. And in terms of the state of Arizona, the University of Arizona holds all of the tapes and transcripts for that specific project. The thing is, it was in the 1960s, so nobody signed anything. And for that reason, it's not actually permissible for those pieces of property to be shared. They have not been digitized, although there are transcripts of them. Individuals can receive information from an index of tapes, so there's an actual hard copy book that they can look through and see if something exists. However, only the interviewers, the interviewees, or the direct descendants of the interviewees have access to the collection or can receive any part of the transcripts or the recordings. And I included an image here of Doris Duke. Unfortunately, when I uploaded to VoiceThread, it kind of covered up my last point. The second collection we spoke a great deal about was the Grenville Goodwin collection. And he was a missionary to the Arizona Apaches, and he took these incredibly detailed notes. And eventually those were submitted to the archive. Now, he did publish a book, which you can see here is the Social Organization of the Western Apache. But really, the information people want is what's in the archives. Now, it was open at one point, but has since been closed because of the sensitive nature of some of the material. Those who are requesting access have to work with the Apache tribe members and the archivists to gain that access. So they have to get permission from both sides and get proper documentation. For example, Ms. Graham told me about 2 boxes that are marked religious papers, and those require a letter on official letterhead from a tribal authority to grant a person access, and all tribes must agree to this access. There are multiple ethical dilemmas that the library and archives juggle pretty continuously. First being dig sites. They do grant the permits for the different archaeological digs, and so they have to make sure that all the paperwork is in order. They have to maintain copies of the surveys and the results from those excavations, and they also have to protect their locations, because if someone were to, for example, locate a burial ground, you wouldn't want another person to go in and go through those materials and try and steal things. There are apparently still grave robbers, and so there has to be a certain amount of confidentiality. Repatriation is the process of returning cultural materials to different Native American tribes. And the challenges in this are making sure that these tribes have somewhere to safely house these materials. And Ms. Graham actually said sometimes they don't want those pieces back because they don't have anywhere to store them. And there is a constant juggling of making sure that they're properly stored and cataloged at the archives, but also available or possibly available to transfer to these different tribes. Funding, as with almost anything, is a huge issue because the funding cuts to the archives have left them short-staffed and have made it very difficult for them to go through their full backlog. And so they have a great deal of different kinds of materials, not solely Native American, that are kind of just sitting there in boxes waiting to be cataloged. And the cataloging of Native American materials is not a simple process because it requires a great deal of collaboration with the tribes in order to appropriately identify things, to possibly return them. If not to return them, then to make sure that they are protected in an appropriate way. So it's very complicated trying to balance funding and figure out how to spread those dollars around. Donations, as with any museum or archives, are also questionable. They need to make sure that those are not ill-gotten gains, that they haven't been, oh, I got this from my uncle a long time ago kind of thing. They want to make sure that anything they're accepting has not been stolen and has not been donated before because of tax purposes. Access is a huge issue because they are a federal repository. They do want to provide access to information. At the same time, they have an ethical and legal duty to protect those cultural materials that are very sacred. And so really access and protection are separate dilemmas, but they're also one together. And it's a constant balance that really has to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. So coming into this interview with Ms. Graham, I had a lot of unanswered questions related to the protocol for Native American archive materials. And basically what I found was that there was a whole lot of drama around this. So the protocols were first developed actually at the Northern Arizona University campus in 2006. And there's an image here that shows the small group of professionals and experts who came together and they created it. There are 10 components of the protocols and recommendations. Where I became confused was that these were never accepted by the Society of American Archivists, and that seemed very strange to me. I did read the protocols. I felt like they were somewhat emotional, and they really conveyed a sense of respect and a feeling of, I don't want to say repentance, but definitely an apologetic feeling, and they really focused on healing the relationships. What I was able to find out in speaking to Ms. Graham is that many archivists actually felt insulted by it because it sort of implied that they were either being ignorant in their duties and not taking care of these materials, or that they were intentionally disrespecting these materials in some way. They also thought it was very restrictive. Now, Ms. Graham pointed out that this needed to happen because it got a conversation started, but it was just that. It was a start. Since then, the fervor around the protocols has settled down quite a bit, and it is continuously revised. In fact, if you go to the Society of American Archivists homepage, they have a whole page dedicated to the updated information on the protocols. So what Ms. Graham really emphasized is that the spirit of the protocols is the most important thing when looking at one's own policy. In my evaluation of the Arizona State Museum Library and Archives, I found a lot of positives. Currently, they're revising their protocols and policies, so they're making a good faith effort at keeping things updated. They have developed specific templates for cataloging, so when they are processing something and they are describing the material, they may check off certain things, specific restrictions that go along with those items. They do have restrictions that vary according to collection, so they try to be as open access as they can. So for example, they may allow you to view something but not reproduce it. They can't give you full access, but the attempt to give you as much access as possible is there. They're digitizing only in very specific instances in order to make sure that they don't start putting all kinds of culturally sensitive material on the internet. They've completed a successful repatriation in Snaketown, and there's a federal repository there. They transferred all of those materials, and they have a really strong working relationship. They've had ODM interns who gained practical experience with them for 1 year, came in, shadowed, and worked with them, and they've gone to see these interns in action now. They have a curator of Native American relations, and she is a liaison with the individual tribes' cultural resource managers, and that also then involves the tribal councils. So there's a lot of collaboration. There's a strong bridge between the archives and the tribes. They also have what's called the Southwest Native Nations Advisory Board, and this is made up of individuals who are appointed by their tribe. They meet quarterly. They discuss all different issues. It depends on what's kind of on the docket, but among them are repatriation. If they're doing a new exhibit and they want to clarify what might be shown or what might not be shown, or even descriptions and labels, and then just general questions that they have. While there were a great deal of positives, there are still some areas for improvement. Notably, the existing policies are actually not really existing. There isn't much that is official and in writing, and they had kind of realized they were handling everything really on a case-by-case basis, depending on the materials that were requested and the individuals who were requesting them. This relies heavily, though, on archivists who have been working in the archives for a while and understand the materials. And so they feel that they require more consistency. In terms of that, they have written down the very specific protocols and restrictions that they feel need to be part of the policies, and they've submitted those. So when the new policies are updated, they will be included. They don't have any kind of orientation or training in cultural sensitivity or laws or procedures for new staff or volunteers, which was particularly surprising to me because there are some very, very sacred and protected objects in the archives. There are also a great many laws that they are responsible for following, regardless of whether they know about them or not. So I feel that some kind of orientation would probably go a long way to ensuring that they're compliant. And the last thing is really kind of an issue that everyone is struggling with, and that is the issue of the funding shortage. And it's created a problem with securing the collections because they have huge backlogs that have never been processed. And Ms. Graham really expressed a desire for someday someone to write a large grant and spend like 5 years working with tribal consultants and going through all of those different pieces. It would require gaining permissions from the tribes, working collaboratively to identify things, possibly to repatriate some of it, in other cases to catalog and store it. It would be a huge, huge project, but it is really very necessary for those materials. And we've reached my final slide, which are my discussion questions. And of course, if you have any feedback or thoughts that you'd like to share in lieu of answering a discussion question, I welcome that and love to hear your feedback. I focused on some of the more pressing things I found. The first one relating to NAGPRA and looking at, instead of being forced to find a giant grant, should NAGPRA be expanded so that funding is provided for places like the Arizona State Museum Library so that they can catalog and secure those collections, because they do have a responsibility to care for those collections. And right now, you could argue, because they're kind of just sitting there in boxes, they aren't as well cared for as they should be. I'm also interested in hearing, what kind of trainings do you think that the Arizona State Museum Library should require of its staff? These could be one time only, like when you first start working there, or yearly updates on things, and why would these trainings be useful? And then going back to my ethical dilemmas page, of the 6 of them, which one do you feel is the most urgent and requires the most immediate attention? I thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I still look forward to hearing your thoughts.